A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Picture yourself on a pristine white sand beach. The water sparkles like diamonds. The sun kisses your skin and everything feels right with the world. Then something catches your eye on the horizon. A vessel unlike anything you've ever seen, growing larger as it approaches. Strange men emerge from the waves carrying long, gleaming objects. Their words are gibberish to your ears, but you and your community, driven by curiosity and warmth, swim out to welcome them. You bring food, fresh water, treasures from your village. Weapons? You don't even know what those are. You open your hearts and hands to these strangers. Meanwhile, one of these men, their leader, scratches into his journal. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. That encounter on a small Bahamian island in 1492 is where most textbooks launch the American story. They dress it up as a, quote, discovery. But for the Arawak Indians who already called this place home, discovery had nothing to do with it. It was an invasion, plain and simple. This is the narrative they probably never shared with you in social studies class. It's not about marble statues of presidents or oil paintings of generals. It's about the everyday people they ruled over and the ones they crushed. It's about the rebels who wouldn't stay quiet, the outcasts society tried to erase, and the forgotten voices echoing from the edges of our official story. Today, we're exploring one of the most important, controversial, and genuinely mind-bending books ever written about America, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. When this book hit shelves in 1980, it was like dropping a pebble into still water. The ripples just kept spreading. It sold millions of copies, not because some slick marketing team pushed it, but because it spoke a truth that countless people felt deep in their gut but had never seen spelled out. Zinn, a former shipyard worker turned historian and passionate activist, made a revolutionary choice. He flipped history on its head. Rather than telling America's story through the eyes of the conquerors and the wealthy, he chose to share it from the viewpoint of the conquered and the struggling. From the Arawaks who welcomed Columbus with open arms, from the enslaved Africans sweating in cotton fields, from poor white farmers rising up against colonial elites, from young women grinding away in textile mills, from soldiers ordered to kill for reasons nobody bothered explaining to them. By the time we're done today, you'll see this country's history through completely different eyes. You'll understand that America's story isn't some straight line of progress and glory. It's a story of fierce, unrelenting conflict between the wealthy and the struggling, the powerful and the powerless, masters and slaves, dominators and the dominated. Understanding that conflict, that hidden history, is your key to making sense of the world we're living in right now. This isn't just dusty tales from the past. This is about who we are today and who we might choose to become tomorrow. So where do we start unraveling a nation's story? Usually, we kick things off with celebration. Heroic explorers, courageous founding fathers, the noble birth of a new world. But Howard Zinn asks us to start somewhere completely different. He wants us to start with the price tag, the human price tag. Let's travel back to that beach in 1492. Christopher Columbus has just arrived, greeted by the Arawak people. His journal describes them as well-built, attractive, and incredibly generous. They eagerly traded everything they owned. Columbus noticed they had no concept of weapons. When he showed them a sword, they grabbed it by the blade and cut themselves. In that very same journal entry, he penned those chilling words, "With 50 men, we could subjugate them all." Gold, was Columbus's obsession. He'd convinced the Spanish king and queen to fund his voyage by promising unimaginable riches. But the Bahamas weren't exactly overflowing with gold. The Arawaks wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears, and that sealed their fate. Columbus grabbed some of them, demanding they lead him to the gold source. This became the template for the next 500 years of American history. On Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Columbus's crew established a nightmare regime. Every native over 14 had to deliver a specific amount of gold every 3 months. Those who succeeded got a copper token to wear around their neck. Those caught without it, they had their hands chopped off and bled to death. The task was impossible. The only gold existed as tiny dust particles in streams. The Arawaks fled. They were hunted like animals with dogs. They began committing mass suicide, using poison to escape the Spanish. Mothers killed their own babies to spare them from this terrifying new enemy. Within 2 years, half of the 250,000 natives on Haiti were gone, murdered, mutilated, or driven to suicide. By 1550, only 500 remained. By 1650, not a single original Arawak or their descendant was left on the island. Complete genocide. You might think that's shocking but isolated, an unfortunate but necessary price for civilization's progress. That's the first major myth Zinn asks us to demolish. He shows this wasn't an exception, it was the blueprint. What Columbus did to the Arawaks, Cortés replicated with the Aztecs in Mexico. What Pizarro did to the Incas in Peru, the Virginia settlers did to the Powhatans, and the Massachusetts Pilgrims did to the Pequots. When the English landed in Virginia in 1607, they settled in Chief Powhatan's territory. The English were literally starving, digging up graves to eat corpses during winter. Some ran off to join the Indians, who at least had food. Instead of learning from the natives, the colonial governor sent soldiers to take revenge. They torched an Indian village, killed 15 or 16 people, destroyed their corn, and captured the queen and her children. They threw the children overboard, and, as one colonist casually wrote, shot OWTT their brains in the water. The English couldn't enslave the Indians. They were too resourceful on their own land. They couldn't live peacefully with them because they wanted their land. So extermination became the answer. Official policy became deception. Pretend peace, let the Indians plant their corn, then right before harvest, attack, kill as many as possible, and burn everything. This pattern repeated itself endlessly. In New England, the Puritans, those folks were taught were seeking religious freedom, used the Bible to justify stealing Indian land. They declared it a legal vacuum because the Indians hadn't subdued it European style. In 1636, they went to war against the Pequot tribe. They surrounded a Pequot village on the Mystic River, set it ablaze, and shot anyone trying to escape. William Bradford, Plymouth's governor, described it as a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. He called it a sweet sacrifice, and thanked God. History, Zinn reminds us, is never neutral. Choosing to celebrate Columbus's navigation skills while barely mentioning his genocide is an ideological choice. It's saying, sure, bad stuff happened, but it wasn't that important in the big picture. It buries atrocities under the romance of progress. But progress for whom? Zinn's entire book answers that question. He argues American history isn't about one united people. It's about fierce conflicts of interest between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, rich and poor. In a world of victims and executioners, Zinn says, thinking people shouldn't side with the executioners. So he retells our history from the other side. The Constitution story is told from the slaves' standpoint. Andrew Jackson's story is seen through Cherokee eyes as he drove them from their land. Industrialism's rise is witnessed by young women working in Lowell textile mills. This isn't about guilt for the past. It's about understanding how that past created our present. The easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, Zinn writes, is still with us. That acceptance began with the very first interactions on this continent. It was cemented by another foundational crime, slavery. In 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying about 20 Africans. They answered the colonists' desperate need for labor. Virginians couldn't force Indians to work, and there weren't enough white indentured servants to cultivate the wildly profitable tobacco fields. So they turned to African slaves. Why them? Because they were helpless. They'd been ripped from their land, culture, and families. They were packed onto ships in coffin-sized spaces, chained together in darkness, choking on the stench of their own waste. Maybe 1 in 3 died during the journey. But profits were so enormous the trade continued for centuries. By 1800, 10 to 15 million Africans had been transported to the Americas. Africa lost an estimated 15 million human beings to this slave trade, the brutal engine of early capitalism. The myth we're often fed is that racism is somehow natural, some deep-seated hatred of white against black. Zinn argues this is a convenient lie. Slavery wasn't born from racism. Racism was born from slavery. Think about it. The first white settlers desperately needed labor. Africans were available, vulnerable, and profitable. Enslaving them was a practical business decision. But how do you justify treating humans like cattle? You create an ideology. You declare them less than human. You use skin color as a mark of inferiority. Racism became the convenient, self-perpetuating justification for economic exploitation. But even this system wasn't perfect. The colonists lived in constant fear, not just of slave rebellion, but that poor, angry whites would join with black slaves to overthrow the whole system. This is a crucial, often hidden part of our story. In the early days, white indentured servants and black slaves often worked together, lived together, and ran away together. They saw each other as sharing the same miserable situation. In 1676, this fear became reality in something called Bacon's Rebellion. Virginia was run by a small elite of wealthy landowners in Jamestown. They'd pushed poor white frontiersmen westward into Indian territory, then refused to protect them from attacks. A wealthy landowner named Nathaniel Bacon harnessed the anger of these poor whites, along with black slaves and white servants. They marched on Jamestown, burned it down, and sent the governor running. The rebellion was eventually crushed. Leaders were hanged. But the ruling class learned something valuable. They had to divide the poor. So they started making concessions to poor whites, a few more rights, a little more status. They began teaching them that no matter how poor they were, being white made them superior to any black person. They gave poor white men guns and jobs as plantation overseers, turning them into guards for the system. This, Zinn says, was the birth of a complex and ingenious control system. The ruling class maintained power by creating a buffer class of slightly privileged people who'd help control the truly oppressed. They created a screen of racial contempt to separate dangerous poor whites from dangerous black slaves. This brings us to the American Revolution, We think of it as a united fight for freedom against English tyranny. But was it really? By 1760, there had been 18 uprisings aimed at overthrowing colonial governments, 6 black rebellions, and 40 riots. The colonies were seething with class anger. Poor tenant farmers against rich landlords, city mechanics against wealthy merchants. The Revolution's leaders, men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, were part of the colonial elite. They were wealthy landowners and merchants. Sure, they were angry at England for taxing them and restricting their ability to get even wealthier. But they also worried about the rebellious energy at home. The Founding Fathers' genius was figuring out how to channel that energy. They created a new nation, a new symbol, a new legal unity called the United States. And they used powerful new language, the language of liberty and equality. The Declaration of Independence is brilliant. It lists grievances against the king and famously declares all men are created equal, with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This language was powerful enough to unite enough colonists to fight England. But who was included in all men are created equal? Not the Indians, whom the Declaration calls merciless Indian savages. Not the black slaves, who made up 1/5 of the population. Not women, who were politically invisible. The Declaration was for white, property-owning men. The Revolution itself wasn't a war of poor against rich. It was fought by the poor, for the rich. The wealthy could avoid the draft by paying for a substitute. The poor had to serve. When Continental Army soldiers mutinied over not being paid or fed, George Washington had the leaders executed. After the war, when debt-ridden Massachusetts farmers, many Revolutionary War veterans, rebelled against the new government in Shays' Rebellion, the new elite crushed them militarily. The Constitution, written in 1787, wasn't a document for the people. It was created by 55 wealthy men to protect their own interests. Historian Charles Beard, who studied the framers' economic backgrounds, found most were lawyers, landowners, slaveholders, and moneylenders. They created a strong central government that could protect them from rebellions like Shays, enforce contracts, collect taxes, and protect their property. They created a representation system favoring the wealthy. The president wouldn't be elected by the people, but by electors. Senators would be chosen by state legislatures. They created a Supreme Court, appointed for life, as the ultimate guardian of the existing order. This is what Zinn calls a kind of revolution. The colonial elite got rid of England, but kept the wealth and power system intact. They gave just enough rights to just enough white males to create broad support and act as a buffer against Indians, slaves, and very poor whites. They created the most effective national control system in modern history, combining the appearance of liberty with the reality of class rule. And what about the other half of the population, the women? Zinn dedicates a chapter to what he calls the intimately oppressed. Women were invisible in history books, reflecting their submerged status. English law, inherited by the colonies, made a woman essentially her husband's property. Her legal existence was suspended during marriage. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or keep her own wages. But here, too, there was resistance. Women like Anne Hutchinson in Massachusetts Bay Colony defied church fathers, insisting on her right to interpret the Bible herself. She was tried for heresy and banished. During the Revolution, women formed patriotic groups, boycotted British goods, and took direct action, like the Boston women who seized a wealthy merchant hoarding coffee and took his keys. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John at the Continental Congress, urging him to Remember the ladies in the new laws. Warning, we are determined to foment a rebellion. But they weren't remembered. After the revolution, none of the new state constitutions gave women the vote. The cult of true womanhood, in the 19th century, told women their place was home, to be pious, pure, domestic, and submissive. But industrialization pulled women from homes into factories. In Lowell, Massachusetts textile mills, young women worked 12 to 16 hours daily for pennies. And they rebelled. They struck in the 1830s, forming some of the first women's unions. This is America's hidden history, continuous resistance. As the country expanded westward, it wasn't some romantic adventure of brave pioneers. It was brutal conquest against the Native Americans living on that land. President Andrew Jackson, a land speculator and slave owner, became the great hero of Indian removal. He forced the Cherokees, who'd adopted many aspects of white civilization, with a written language, newspaper, and constitution, to leave their ancestral Georgia homes and march westward on what became the Trail of Tears. On that march, 4,000 of 17,000 Cherokees died. Jackson told them that beyond the Mississippi they'd possess the land as long as grass grows or water runs. Like hundreds of other promises made to Indians, it was broken. Westward expansion led directly to war with Mexico in 1846. The United States provoked conflict, then claimed Mexico had, quote, shed American blood upon American soil. It was conquest that ended with the U.S. taking half of Mexico's territory, modern California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado. All this new land became a battleground over slavery's extension, leading to the Civil War. The Civil War, Zinn argues, wasn't started by Abraham Lincoln to free slaves. It was a war to save the Union and, more importantly, to save the industrializing North's economic system, which conflicted with the South's agrarian, slave-based system. Lincoln personally opposed slavery but was a cautious politician. His first priority was keeping the Union together. He only issued the Emancipation Proclamation when pressured by abolitionists and when he realized it was a necessary military move to weaken the South. The proclamation itself was carefully worded, freeing slaves only in areas still rebelling, not in areas under Union control. As one English newspaper noted, the principle is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States. The slaves themselves pushed the war toward true liberation. 500,000 slaves ran from plantations to Union lines. 200,000 black men joined the Union Army and fought bravely, despite being paid less than white soldiers and facing intense racism. After the war came a brief, remarkable period called Reconstruction. With federal troops in the South, black men could vote and hold office. Black children went to school for the first time. A genuine revolution seemed possible. But it was a revolution from the top, easily undone. By 1877, Northern elites, wanting business stability and tired of the Southern problem, made a deal with Southern elites. The Compromise of 1877 withdrew federal troops from the South and abandoned the black population to white supremacist rule. The promise of freedom was betrayed. This betrayal set the stage for what Zinn calls the other Civil War, the great explosive conflict between labor and capital in the late 19th century. This was the robber baron era, men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan building enormous fortunes while their workers toiled in dangerous conditions for starvation wages. And the workers fought back. There were massive, violent strikes, like the great 1877 railroad strike that shook the country, the 1886 Haymarket Affair, the 1892 Homestead Strike, the 1894 Pullman Strike. In each case, workers met the combined force of corporations and government. Police, militia, and federal troops were used repeatedly to break strikes and jail labor leaders. The courts sided with the rich. The Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment, supposedly protecting black people's rights, as protecting corporations, calling them persons who couldn't be deprived of property without due process. Meanwhile, millions of farmers, crushed by debt and exploited by railroads and banks, organized the greatest agrarian rebellion in American history, the populist movement. They created the People's Party, and for a moment a powerful alliance of farmers and workers, black and white, seemed ready to challenge the system. But the movement was ultimately absorbed and defeated by the Democratic Party, which played on racial fears to divide the poor. How did the system survive all this rebellion? Zinn points to two powerful tools. First, patriotism, especially during wartime. Just as class anger reached a boiling point, the country was swept into the 1898 Spanish-American War. Theodore Roosevelt called it a, quote, splendid little war. It was a war for empire, to take Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain and bring them into America's sphere of influence. It was about opening foreign markets for American goods. And it united the country in a common cause, drowning class resentment in nationalistic fervor. As one politician said, the war gave the country a new appetite, the yearning to show our strength. The taste of empire is in the mouth of the people. The second tool was reform. The progressive era of the early 1900s wasn't, Zinn argues, a great victory for the people. It was calculated reforms from the top, designed to quiet growing socialist and labor movements and stabilize the capitalist system. Men like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson weren't trustbusters. They were trust regulators. They didn't want to destroy corporations. They wanted to make them more efficient and less likely to provoke rebellion. This combination of patriotism and reform proved incredibly effective. World War I was, as radical writer Randolph Bourne said, the health of the state. The government used the war to crush dissent, jailing thousands of socialists, anarchists, and anti-war activists under the Espionage Act. Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party leader, got 10 years in prison for an anti-war speech. The 1920s seemed prosperous, but wealth concentrated at the top. The labor movement weakened. Radical movements were in shambles. Then came the Great Depression. The system collapsed. By 1933, 15 million were unemployed. People were starving in the world's richest country. And they rebelled. Rent strikes, hunger marches, spontaneous actions by the unemployed to stop evictions. In spring 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans, the Bonus Army, marched on Washington demanding help, and President Hoover ordered the Army, led by Douglas MacArthur, to drive them out with tear gas and bayonets. In this atmosphere of crisis and rebellion, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected. The New Deal was, like progressive reforms, a way to save capitalism from itself. It gave just enough help to just enough people to prevent full-scale revolution, jobs, unemployment insurance, Social Security. It legalized unions through the Wagner Act, but it didn't fundamentally change wealth and power distribution. What ended the Depression wasn't the New Deal, it was World War II. The war created millions of jobs and enormous corporate profits. And once again, patriotism and a common enemy united the country and silenced dissent. World War II was portrayed as a people's war against fascism. Hitler's Germany was unspeakable evil. But Zinn asks us to examine closely the Allied powers, motives, and actions. The United States had done little to stop fascism in the 1930s. It wasn't Hitler's persecution of Jews that brought America to war, but the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, an attack on a link in the American Pacific Empire. During the war, the U.S. fought a segregated war with black soldiers in separate units. It rounded up 110,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast and put them in concentration camps. It ended the war by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki's civilian populations, acts of terror that were militarily unnecessary, as Japan was already on the verge of surrender. After the war, the United States emerged as the dominant world power. It created a permanent war economy and global empire, justifying everything with a new crusade, the Cold War, against communism. The government used communist fear to suppress dissent at home, with loyalty oaths and witch hunts, and to justify military interventions worldwide in Greece, Korea, Iran, Guatemala, Cuba. And then came Vietnam. The Vietnam War was the culmination of this empire history. It was war against a peasant revolutionary movement in a tiny country, modern technology against organized humans. And the humans won. The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam than in all of World War II. It used napalm and chemical poisons. It killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, but it couldn't break the Vietnamese people's will. At home, it created the greatest anti-war movement the nation had seen. It started with students and civil rights activists, but grew to include veterans, soldiers, priests, nuns, and millions of ordinary Americans. It was a movement questioning not just the war, but the entire system that produced it. This home rebellion, Zinn argues, was critical in ending the war. The government couldn't fight abroad while its own people were in revolt. The 60s and 70s were a time of astonishing uprisings. The Black Revolt, the Women's Movement, the Indian Movement, the Prisoners' Movement, all the silenced and forgotten groups found their voice. It was a time of surprises, when the system seemed, for a moment, to be losing control. The government responded with co-optation and repression. It passed new civil rights laws. It brought a few black and women leaders into the system. It also used the FBI and police to harass, disrupt, and destroy militant groups like the Black Panthers. The Watergate scandal that brought down Richard Nixon seemed like a victory for the people. But Zinn sees it differently, the system cleansing itself of a clumsy rule-breaker. It got rid of Nixon but kept the system of imperial power and corporate control intact. The presidencies of Carter, Reagan, and Bush, Democrat or Republican, continued the same basic policies: huge military budgets, tax cuts for the rich, cuts in social programs for the poor, and support for repressive regimes abroad, friendly to American business. The gap between rich and poor grew wider than ever. Bill Clinton's 1992 election brought promises of change, but his presidency largely continued the bipartisan consensus of serving corporate interests while making small public concessions. This brings us to Zinn's final, powerful idea, the coming revolt of the guards. He argues the American system has been maintained not just by the 1% at the top, but by the loyalty of a large group of guards, the middle class, professionals, police, soldiers. These people get enough rewards to keep them on the elite's side, acting as a buffer between the very rich and very poor. But what happens when the guards themselves become disillusioned? When the middle class feels its own economic insecurity, when soldiers refuse to fight, when government employees leak secrets, when the people running the system no longer believe in it. This, Zinn says, is the great hope for the future. He believes the system, in its relentless pursuit of profit and power, is beginning to fail not just the poor, but the middle classes too. Economic anxieties, environmental disasters, the moral sickness of endless wars. These problems can no longer be confined to ghettos or battlefields. They're affecting everyone. The future is uncertain, but Zinn ends not with prediction, but with hope. Hope that the 99% will one day recognize their common interest and common enemy. That prisoners and guards will realize they're in the same prison. That people will discover their own power to resist, organize, and create a new kind of society based on cooperation, not competition, on human need, not corporate profit. He reminds us of the countless, often unreported acts of resistance throughout our history. And he concludes that this permanent adversarial culture holds the promise of a different, more humane future. So what do we take away from this powerful and for many unsettling journey through American history? First, and most importantly, Howard Zinn teaches us that history isn't a spectator sport. How we tell our stories matters. The history we learned in school isn't some neutral fact collection. It's a story told from a particular viewpoint, and that viewpoint has almost always been the powerful's perspective. By choosing to tell the story from the powerless perspective, Zinn isn't just adding missing details. He's fundamentally changing the story's meaning. He's showing us America has never been a finished product, some shining city on a hill. It's always been a battleground. Second, he gives us a powerful new lens for viewing the present. When we see government talk about the national interest in a foreign war, we can ask, whose interest? When politicians talk about economic growth, we can ask, growth for whom? When we see conflict between two groups of poor people, black and white, native-born and immigrant, we can ask, who benefits from this division? Zinn's history inoculates us against the soothing, unifying rhetoric that so often masks exploitation's reality. Finally, and perhaps his greatest gift, Zinn's work is a profound antidote to despair. It would be easy to read this oppression history and feel hopeless, but that's not the book's effect. On the contrary, it's a story of incredible resilience, a testament to the enduring human spirit. Despite the overwhelming power of the state, corporations, military, police, people have never stopped fighting back. The slaves who rebelled, the women who organized, the workers who struck, the soldiers who refused to fight, these are Zinn's true heroes. He shows us that change, real change, has never come from the top. It's always come from the bottom. From collective actions of ordinary people who decided the world they were given wasn't the world they had to accept. So what can you do with this knowledge? Start by questioning. Next time you read a headline or listen to a politician's speech, ask yourself, whose story is being told here, and whose is being left out? Seek out voices from the bottom up. Read alternative press. Listen to activists, stories. Learn the history of movements that have challenged the status quo. Remember that your own actions, however small they may seem, are part of this ongoing history. The choices you make, the values you live by, how you treat others, all of this contributes to the kind of world we'll create. Zinn's history isn't a call to guilt or anger for their own sake. It's a call to awareness and action. It's a reminder the world isn't fixed, it's still being made, and we, all of us, are the ones making it. That was the book summary of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We've hit the highlights today, but I'll be honest, a summary can only take you so far. The real magic happens when you read the book yourself. It's in those quiet moments when a particular story or simple phrase hits you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, grab a copy. Because reading it isn't just learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see yourself and your daily life. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep growing together.